welcome back to my channel. If you don't know what's happening today, well, you're part of a long-standing tradition of approximately 1.5 years in which I read the whole of the Women's Prize for Fiction long list and talk to you about it and try and predict the shortlist before it happens. This could either be history in the making or just a sad woman in a sequin shirt sitting in her slightly mouldy shed. Let's find out. There were 16 books on this long list. I gave myself one DNF pass as I did in 2021, and boy did I need it. But as usual with this prize, I discovered some really interesting books I definitely wouldn't have picked up otherwise. There were 9 debut authors on the list, and then 2 authors that have actually already won the prize before, Maggie O'Farrell and Barbara Kingsover. The requirements, as stated by the Women's Prize, for winning this prize is a piece of outstanding, ambitious and original fiction written in English by a woman between these dates. And as always, trying to backseat judge a prize like this makes me think about what makes a good book. I have to underline in my judgment of these books that plot and concept, especially when it's telling a really important story, make an incredible book. But in the circumstances of this prize, it's not gonna automatically give it a pass to my shortlist. To make my shortlist, you have to also write sentences I want to underline. You have to use the literary form to be original and ambitious as well as just good. And ambitious to me means either doing something completely new, something that feels unhackneyed and genuinely inventive, or doing something really old but in a really thorough, outstanding way, something that's a challenge to pull off. So I think we have to separate in our minds the judgment that something is a good book, something that is worth reading, has a worthy theme, but doesn't deserve to win a literary prize for style, for the very skill of writing a book. They're different things, and for that reason, I have separated all the 16 books into 4 categories. Because I think the reason that some of the books didn't make my shortlist cross over, and I think it's going to be easier to talk about them in packs. If I was going to pick like a common thread between a lot of the books this year, it would be civilians in war, whether they're actually living in a literal war zone or something that could extrapolate into one, and that was extremely stressful to read. And I'm going to highlight some books that I genuinely think that you should pick up, but I do think the moment that we let just the most tragic story win the prize, it ceases to be a literary prize and starts to serve topics that frankly other prizes cover. With all that said, let's get into the categories. The first category is who is driving this thing? These are the books that score the lowest in my estimation. I know we're all sad to see this one on the list because I was very excited about the cover and the concept, but let me tell you for why. I think an epitome of this category and why I called this category who is driving this thing is because of The Dog of the North. This is a book that I speculated that I might not like because of the cover and the premise. I said it was the equivalent of literary gingham curtains, which while people like gingham curtains are nice, they don't deserve to win next in fashion. And I think I would like to jump to my own defense and say I am somebody who is willing to be wrong about a cover. That will become clear in later categories. Elizabeth Mackenzie is really good at writing old, eccentric characters and really good at one-liners. She'd probably make a really good TV script writer, but for me this was an absolute mess of a plot. I'm willing as a reader to not know where something is going, but I honestly felt like I was on a hijacked minibus with nobody in the driving seat. It felt kind of like a discovery write, which is when you write a draft of a book without knowing where it's going to go, but then nobody returned to it or amended it or gave it any kind of style or substance after that. It's also, misleadingly from the cover and the blurb, not really about a road trip or a minibus. This isn't even her minibus. She sleeps on it sometimes, but it's not hers. There is a road trip that lasts about a chapter maximum, and there's also not a dog. There is a dog, but it's not really her dog, and it doesn't really play a big part in the book. So I think on the publisher's side, this was like massively oversold, and I thought that while there were funny things in it, I didn't trust that the author knew where it was going, and there was honestly no payoff at the end either. I also just like to say that while I am willing to read more books about women in their 30s whose lives are a mess and everything's fallen apart and they're going through the divorce and they don't know what they're doing with their lives, I'm willing to keep reading books like that, but I'm not willing to keep reading books like that when there is no backstory and no substance for the main character and they don't have a very complex internal world. That is a boundary I'm now setting And while I can say that it was a fast and pacey read and not completely unenjoyable, I don't know why it made the long list over books like The Sea of Tranquility, because there's just no competition. Cursed Bread had a really intriguing concept of a baker's wife who is sick of her life and gets obsessed with a woman in her village. It has the bookshop meets Carol kind of vibes, and there were some really vibrant scenes in this, but overall it felt, this is one of the shortest books on the list, and it felt like it would never end for me. I feel like it went for shock factor over substance. There were lots of interesting ways I feel like the character could have gone in, and she doesn't really go in any of those ways. And I also felt the letter portions were really inadequately linked to the main plot. So I just feel like it was, for me as a reader, really hard to follow when it shouldn't have been, because not that much is happening. It's a no from me. And then thirdly, this one is in my bottom tier, sadly, because I am interested in reading about cyber stalking. I'm interested in vignette books written in this style, and I have tabbed up a few of the paragraphs because I thought they were wonderfully written. This was written incredibly sparsely and therefore really hard to connect with what was happening in the plot. There was a lot of like static self-sabotage in which a woman just repeatedly keeps putting herself in harmful situations without any introspection or like interesting insight. There are these very strange inserts, like almost like there was feedback given on the book that it had to go somewhere more introspective, and it almost felt that depth was retrofitted with these tiny little articles about the state of the world that were very well written and very interesting, but didn't feel like they were actually in the tone of voice of the main character, and also weren't in any kind of authorial voice. So it was just a very strange read that actually didn't really feel like it was about being obsessed with anybody or a fan. It was about a woman who briefly cyber stalks this influencer who is also sleeping with the man that she wants to be with. But it's mainly about the grip this man has on her life and not really about the woman. So again, I thought that it would be going in a more interesting way than just like a woman who is obsessed with a man endlessly, even though he has no interesting traits, and even she as a character can't describe why she even likes him. So you can't even get invested in a weird self-sabotagey way. It's just, I was really disappointed in this book, but I do think that there probably is a readership for it, and it might be a taste thing. So for example, if you like Conversations with Friends or Luster or Exciting Times, I didn't like this book in the way that I didn't like any of those books, so maybe if you like those books you will like this. Logic. The next category is called Nudge Nudge, Wink Wink. It is possible to write a book about something niche or something that not everybody knows about and make it understandable for people who don't already know about it and make it exciting for those people. That's a thing that can be done. But because these books were so heavily influenced by things in culture that I don't know about, I felt like there was a lack of universality to the books that meant that you could only really enjoy them if you knew the source material. I think Natalie Haynes is a very funny woman. She's also a stand-up comedian and she's very, very clever. I would be definitely up for reading other books by her. This was the first one I've ever read. It's a retelling of Medusa, and as somebody who is not a Greek scholar and not that like recreationally interested in Greek mythology, I was alarmed to open the first page to over 35 names that I needed to know about and characters that aren't fully like slowly explained one by one. This was really moving, and I do think it made a commentary about Medusa and how her story has been mistold, but as I don't know that story very well, it lacked the impact for me. And the other reason that it's in this category is because I listened to the audiobook, and in the audiobook there are loads of lines that are really genuinely very, very funny, but only because of the delivery. Natalie Haynes reads the audiobook and she's incredibly good at it, but it does mean that every now and then I'd pick up the book and read the same paragraph that I'd read in the audiobook and realise that it really doesn't, for me, that humour didn't really translate to the page. So in that way I do think it was unsuccessfully funny in the literary sense, because it's not funny unless performed. There felt like a lot of nudge nudge wink wink moments when it came to making snide statements about certain presumably famous Greek mythological characters, but because I don't know any of that, it made me feel kind of excluded as a reader. And maybe this needed to be longer, which I rarely say about books, but maybe it needed to be longer so we could unpack that and make sure that everybody is included in the jokes. And I do think that it had a really clever ending, so I would probably give this to a friend who liked Greek mythology, but because of all of the above, I cannot let it on my personal shortlist. Children of Paradise is set in an independent, crumbling and moulding cinema that is being taken over by a corporate company. Setting, 10 out of 10. A very immersive book, kind of like in the way that if you just want to sit in the world of the night circus and have a good time. I don't even want to say it follows the journey of the main character. It follows the external movements of the main character as she moves through this circumstance of being employed by the cinema, integrating herself with the very strange workers who walk the floors of the cinema, and then being there for its demise. But actually you don't get to know the character herself at all. I don't know about you, but if there's a woman who arrives in her late 30s in a town she's never been to before with barely any luggage, and she knows no one, she never calls anyone, she never talks to anyone, I would quite like to know what happened to her in her life before this moment, but it's not even alluded to. I also feel like there were so many characters in this book and you meet them all at once, not in a narrative way where you're given little passages to go down and right, okay, I remember that person looks like that and I met them in this circumstance, okay, I'm ready to absorb a new character. They all just get shoved on you in one moment. It's very hard to differentiate between them, and I felt that loads of really interesting stuff could be done with this setting, and maybe it was and I didn't get it because every chapter is titled a very classic or niche indie film, and maybe there's a big in-joke going on there that I don't get, but it did feel like it was the equivalent of a niche indie movie. Like there was nothing in it for me that made it interesting on its own, and honestly barely anything happens. It's very dependent on setting, apart from at the end, which was, without spoiling it, just the biggest cop-out you could ever imagine. Like, think of one of the most stereotypical, like, cliched cop-outs that you'd find at the end of a book or film. It does one of those. And then thirdly, this is the book that I DNF'd. Damon Copperhead by Barbara Kingslover. I'm really excited to read more of Barbara's work because I've been told it's really good. I think that I met her at the wrong point in her writing career because I am really genuinely not a massive Victorian literary fan. And this is a retelling of David Copperfield set in West Virginia. I got the chance to visit West Virginia. It's actually one of my favourite places I've ever gone in the US, and I do recognise that there are lots of stereotypes about Appalachian people, the history of poverty in that part of the country, and I was excited by the premise that she wanted to do something with the traditions of an English Victorian novel and remix it into this. But I do think that classic literature is there to be improved on and not just mimicked, and even I, as somebody who hadn't read David Copperfield, felt like it was the way the plot was going was so erratic that I was like, oh, this must be only going there because we're mimicking David Copperfield, because it feels like not quite natural. And I honestly feel like one of the things we don't need to preserve about the tradition of Victorian literary fiction is the length. I got 40% of the way through this book, which was a stellar effort, but I would also say that that's not completely a judgment on the book because this was the last book that I tackled, and honestly I was kind of trauma dumped out. Like, I was really burnt out from trauma because of reading the rest of the list, which is not Barbara's fault at all, but I just felt like emotionally I couldn't stand watching this character just go through a consecutive, almost paranormal amount of tragic events that just string one after the other until the end of his life. So I felt okay about DNFing this because I felt like, me as a reader, I wasn't going to love it, and I also just don't think from reading half of it that it was doing anything ambitious enough with the source material to make it onto the shortlist, and that it felt like a little bit of a wink wink nudge moment for Dickens fans. Okay, this next category pertains to the thing that I said at the beginning of the video about things can be excellent books, very enjoyable, but just because I don't think they belong on the shortlist of this particular prize doesn't mean that they're not incredibly good books. These are the books that fall under the category for me of wonderful but not ambitious. Wandering Souls was a short and beautiful, very easy to read, very fast read, following the lives of 3 orphaned Vietnamese children who make it to the UK when they had really been hoping and planning and applying to live in the US, so the disappointment of arriving in the UK is understandable. It is incredibly heartbreaking. It isn't a story that I think we hear enough about, and I think it does something really interesting when it critiques the idea of the exceptional refugee, or once you've escaped something that could have been life-threatening, having to do something really spectacular and externally validating and miraculous afterwards. Like, it critiques that, and I thought that was really important and interesting. However, there is a literary device in it that I don't think was pulled off very well. I won't spoil it for you, but I don't really think it quite worked, and it's something that we experienced chronologically, so there wasn't anything very inventive done plot-wise, and I don't really feel like there was any lines in it that I wanted to underline and be like, that was an amazingly written line. So for those reasons it doesn't make the shortlist, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a really good read, and I definitely don't regret reading it. Homesick is written from the point of view of a child, and if you like reading books from the point of view of a child, say in the style of, say, Room by Emma Donoghue or something like that, then you might really enjoy this. I quite like that point of view as well, and I thought that was really, really well executed. It is a very beautiful book with lots of very visually symbolic and clever scenes in it. It's written in little vignettes, but on the other hand, it didn't feel like a book that I hadn't read before. I know that's a double negative, but you know what I mean? It didn't feel enough like I was like, wow, I've never read anything like this. I've read similar things like this quite a lot. While this one was very well executed, I do feel like it really lost itself in the last kind of 30-40 pages of the book, and it lost me as a reader a little bit. So again, this might be a taste thing, but for me, I don't think it qualified as outstanding and ambitious. So while if somebody was like, this is my favourite book, I'd be like, I get it. It's not my favourite book, and I don't quite think that it has earned its place on the shortlist. This book will stay with me for a very long time, Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, and I read it on the weekend of the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's something that I know a little bit about. I have an Irish passport, my mum's Irish, and I understand a little bit about the Troubles, so I am interested to learn more about it, and this was a very immersive look at what it is like to live in an integrated community during the Troubles, where things aren't as integrated as you'd hope between Catholics and Protestants. It follows a wonderful woman. I loved this character. I felt like I really knew her, who has an alcoholic mother, works in a school, and accidentally falls for an older barrister who is politically involved in trying to stop the Troubles and protect people. And he's very hot. And I know that I'm like, oh, he's like so much older than her, and he used to be friends with her dad. And like, it is definitely weird, but I was also like, Michael felt like a very real character for me, and I was very invested in their love story, so I think that it achieved its goal in that way. I think that it was a great look at what it is to live in a politically volatile place, but also try to live a normal life, and it was also a great love story. But because it was told chronologically, and just because I felt like it wasn't doing anything completely new, it didn't make my shortlist, but I do think it was very good, and people like Nick Hornby, Marion Keyes, and Sarah Moss also agree that it was a very, very good book. So this is a debut, and I'd be really interested to see what she writes next, but I just don't think it didn't quite make the shortlist for me. But the audiobook is great, and you can't beat an audiobook in an Irish accent, so no regrets. And this one almost made the shortlist for me. It really did. This is Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait, probably one of the most famous books that made the long list, and also Maggie O'Farrell has won the prize before. This has a very clever smoking gun on stage check-off device that she uses, where you open the first page and you realise it's about a 16-year-old girl who's recently been married to this man, and she's realising in this moment that he intends to kill her. So that is the premise, and then we start with her early life. She lives in like the 1560s or something in Renaissance Italy. It's so well written, it's so immersive. I actually really loved the first half of the book more than the second. Hearing about her childhood, growing up in this like grandeur that is also quite oppressive, and the kind of child that she was, I thought it was really, really well written. A lot of people are saying that this is Maggie O'Farrell's worst book, and if this is her worst book, I want to read her best one. It didn't make the shortlist for me, because why didn't it make the short? I guess just because I looked at the other books and I thought that they were just slightly more inventive and new and deserved it a little bit more than Maggie, and also Maggie's already won. You've got your chocolate bar, Maggie. So it just felt like this almost made the shortlist, but it wasn't quite as innovative as some of the other stuff, and I think it did the kind of, it was more on the side of like, does an old thing really, really well, rather than doing like a completely new thing. So I did love this. I think it'd be an amazing holiday read, and it has an incredibly unexpected but satisfying ending. So thumbs up, but like not the whole way, you know. Now we're on to the just wow category, so I hope you're ready. Those of you who have been counting will know what's coming. These are the 6 books that I predict will be on the shortlist, or at least should be according to me. And who is a better authority on the world of fiction than a weird, snotty lady sitting in her shed? I have no authority here, Jackie Weaver. But anyway, I'm gonna tell you what I think. I'm gonna go I have actually ordered these, so I'm gonna go 6 to 1. Coming in at number 6 is Firebrush by Jacqueline Crooks. This follows the main character Yame, who spends most of her evenings at the Crypt, which is this underground club literally in a crypt on the outskirts of London with 2 of her friends. She meets this guy called Moose, who is super hot and super lovely. Their love story is cut short in this quite political, interesting and horrific way, and it basically sends her life on a completely different trajectory in which she goes to Bristol, she goes to Jamaica. Not only does it feature a lot of music and also a main character who's just naturally really good at music and that doesn't have to, like, this is a low bar, but I like books where women have a talent and that's not like a point of contention or like a plot point. It's just one of the things, like sometimes women also have talents. So music is really integrated in her life, and I listened to the audiobook and there is a lot of music in the audiobook as well, which is really nice. The way it's written is really musical and lyrical as well, whilst also being really easy to understand, and if you're not really into like books written in verse, then you're safe here. This is still very readable as a novel, but I think that while there was a very pacey, interesting, exciting plot, the reason this is in the shortlist is really because I think the tone of it was really unusual and inventive. The way this is written isn't like anything else that I've read before, and I think that Jacqueline Crooks has a really unique narrative voice. It's almost kind of echoey, if that makes sense. Everything she's saying ties together so well and has echoes throughout the rest of the book that you feel like as you're reading the current chapter you're in, you can kind of hear the echo of the other chapters like bouncing off the wall back at you. I realise that I sound high. I'm not high, it makes sense in my head. It discusses the political ramifications of loss, of coming of age in a community that has been hurting for a very long time, and I just thought it was wonderful. Really bloody wonderful. Coming in at number 5 is Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. What was really interesting about this is that it's written in vignettes from the point of view of lots of different female characters. The timelines are completely mixed up, but it actually makes complete sense as a reader as you read it because it's so cleverly and skillfully constructed. And the way you kind of circle a character's history rather than experiencing it with them helps you to understand them more and the way that they're connected, and it's really clever. It's basically about 3 generations of women and their interactions with the people in their lives and the men in their lives and the toxic masculinity in their lives and the struggles that they face as small business owners in a place that has largely been forgotten by a lot of people, Memphis. But this is also like one of those books where like location is a character, like the location of their house and the street that they live on becomes a character in the book, and it's just very clever and immersive and like a one-off really. I think it's a one-off. I read this book in 24 hours. This is Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, and it hit me in the freaking guts. I wasn't that excited about the premise and I wasn't that excited about the cover. I would love to rewrite the blurb in a way that it would appeal to my own sensibilities because I would have been gutted if I missed this book. This book follows the main character Zora, who is about to live in a war zone but doesn't know it yet. She lives with her husband, who she really loves. She lives near her mum, who is very eccentric, and she's worked incredibly hard to become a semi-famous artist who also teaches art to students. The war starts erupting around her in a very boiling frog kind of way. She doesn't kind of, you see stuff happening in her daily life that you're like, that doesn't seem okay. That seems like there might be a war about to start, but she still goes through the motions of living her normal life because she doesn't know any other way. Eventually her husband is like, we should probably get your mum out of here, and she's like, roger that. I'll follow you though. I'm just gonna stay and teach my classes for a little bit longer, and then I'll come to England and stay with our daughter and her family like later. That becomes not possible, and she starts to live this life that becomes immediately dependent on her neighbours that she only semi knows. She still keeps going to teach her art classes and still keeps going in to paint every day. She has a friend that keeps opening his bookshop even though there are bombs going off all around him, and it's like a very found family. What is the point of art? The experience of a mundane life amongst like the unimaginably crazy world of war. And I can still see some of the scenes. I can't tell you what they are because I don't want to spoil it, but I can still see some of the scenes in my head. I think they're just so vivid and clever, and there was a lot of symbolism in what she chose to show, and I just thought that it was a really well constructed and interesting take on war that I haven't really seen told in this way, in this artist's perspective, and particularly also from an older woman. So bravo Priscilla Morris, you got me. Coming in third place is Glory. I wasn't sure about this book for about half of it. I was really going through it being like, is somebody driving this? Is somebody driving this? And then as you get through the book, you realize that somebody who is incredible at driving is driving this. This is the book, I think, out of all of the books that I really felt I was holding like a meaty piece of literature. This is like a main course meal. I can easily see this being studied in universities. I can totally imagine somebody writing a dissertation on it. There is enough meaty literary skill and layers in this to just keep digging with it. It is, and suspend your disbelief, told from the perspective of animals in a fictional country called Jadada that maps quite succinctly onto the history of Zimbabwe. But isn't Zimbabwe, but kind of is Zimbabwe. I would also like to come for myself and for anyone who is really driving home the point that it is Builder's Animal Farm set in Zimbabwe, because I don't feel like, on reflection, even though I think the author does use that as in shorthand as well, is like a very good way to sell this book to people, because I feel like they'll go in expecting something that it's not. It's actually something quite unique and something that's not really trying to do what Orwell was trying to do at all. Well, for reasons we don't really have time to get into now, I think coming to this book as its own thing is important. And it's also important to remember that Orwell didn't invent anthropomorphic animals. That's a thing that happens in every culture, and it's a long storytelling tradition of having animals as people so that we can have like a degree of separation between looking at ourselves and our own behaviour as humans. That's a tradition that goes across the whole of the African continent, I think, and also in a lot of European traditions as well. So it's actually interesting to me that there are so few books written about anthropomorphic animals who act like humans, because it's like a tradition that maybe we should just see more of, and because this feels like a novelty, we're comparing it to Orwell. It is very, very tongue-in-cheek, and can I say for a moment that the audiobook narrator of this book was really bringing her A game. I have never listened to an audiobook narrator who was this excited to be alive, or so enthused about her topic, or so good at going from grumpy sheep to evangelical horse preacher in like one sentence. I don't understand how she did it. I would really highly recommend listening to this in audio. And while I think there were a few parts where the device of it being an animal like tripped me up, and I go into that more in my Patreon podcast about this book, I don't think that that takes away from all of the amazing literary stuff it is doing. It's very, very fucking funny and really fucking tragic, and having those two things in one book and feeling like you can just like casually flow between them in this natural way is the sign of like a really, really good writer. It discusses collective guilt when it comes to letting a regime take over your country and the complicitness of that. It talks about, as a country, you can be liberated from abuse and have moved colonizers out but not be free. The mimicking of colonizing behavior within your own country, and how ingrained pain can be when it comes to trying to rebuild something better. And another reason it really differentiates from Orwell, I really have to say, is that this book contains hope. Warning, this book contains hope. It's really vigorous in its tackling of the reality of, for example, some of the massacres in Zimbabwe that happened, but it's also really vigorous in the necessity there is to defend humans as inherently good and inherently containing hope. And I really was not expecting this book to happen to me, and it just did. I think the first half is really different from the second half. The payoff is there, and I know why the first half exists and I understand, but I really think once you get into the second half, you're going to start getting this book properly. And it deserves all the accolades it's had. It's been on loads of literary prize shortlists, I think. Oh, Bandit Queens. I've been talking for a long time, so I'm not going to talk too much about this because I could literally talk about it all day. But this is a book about Geeta, who her husband disappears, her very abusive husband disappears, and everybody in the village assumes that she has murdered him. And instead of correcting them, she decides to go along with it. She doesn't deny it, she doesn't confirm it, but she's like, actually, I'm a woman living on my own. It would be quite convenient if everybody thought that I was a little bit dangerous. The problem comes, however, when some of the other wives in the village come to her and say, hey, don't play dumb with me, I know you killed your husband, I'd like to kill my husband, can you help me? And she has to keep up the pretense of having killed her husband, but also kind of prevent them from killing their husbands because she doesn't think killing is right. And then there are, let's just say, some twists. If this was a film, it would be directed by Greta Gerwig or something. It definitely has the feeling of something really dark and funny, and I think maybe if you're a fan of Heathers, you might like it, which is a weird comparison, but trust me. It's really, really beautifully written. The main character goes on a bit of a whirlwind journey, but I can believe every stage of it. It's very psychologically believable. It covers topics like prolonged loneliness and pulling yourself out of that. The idea of this kind of dark sisterhood that isn't putting girl power on a pedestal and being like, oh, isn't it all great that women love each other? Like, they don't, they literally don't. But this complicated feeling in extreme situations in which you don't have a rosy relationship with other women, but there is a resentful solidarity there because you have experienced similar things. It's completely absurd, it's completely wacky, but also incredibly deep, and there's some really incredible paragraphs. Like, the way it's written is very, very good. It is a thriller, but it's kind of more than a thriller, and I'd be surprised if they don't make a film out of this at some point. And finally, this is my humble pie and I'm happy to eat it. This is the book that I thought I would like the least out of the list. Can you believe that when we were watching the unboxing? I thought this book was gonna be shite. YA with no legs and a tail? Okay. It is not what I predicted, which is a YA book set in a scuba diving school with a cover from a free image website. It is actually my winner, my personal winner. What? For fear of over-promising to Overstory fans, people who are fans of the Overstory by Richard Powers, I would compare this more to the Overstory than to anything else I've read recently. It's not told from one dolphin's perspective, it's told from 5 different species' perspective who all have really interesting storylines. It's written with this reverence for nature, and it contains its own really clever internal logic. It even like discusses stuff like dialects between species. There's one character who is biologically moving between male and female depending on their environment, and discussing the fluidity of gender within the natural world. And while it's doing all that, there is never a dull moment. You kind of forget it's about sea creatures, and it's more about just life in general, because the world building is so good. One of the examples is it follows a character who is like the first wife of the chief of a dolphin tribe that have climbed the hierarchical ladder because they're known for their aggression, and she has to be complicit in the sexual violence of the other wives to protect her son, who is coded for all intents and purposes as on the autistic spectrum. There's a character called Google who is a dolphin who has lived in captivity his whole life and has just escaped, not knowing that wild dolphins exist, and basically having a Truman Show moment of being like, what? The humans might not be good? I am probably gonna read this again this year. Like, I want to read it again because it ticks all of the requirements for winning the prize. It is ambitious. Like, who would try and pull this off? I can understand why not everything that's in the book is on the blurb and not all the characters are, because you'd read the blurb and be like, nobody could ever pull this off. It is original. I've never read anything freaking like it before. I'd be very interested to hear if you think you have. It feels very timeless but also very modern. It's commenting subliminally on conservation and stuff like that, but not in a kind of like hitting you over the head with it kind of way. And it is also just really outstanding. There were lots of lines that I was just underlining because I was like, that's a really well constructed sentence. So yeah, nobody's more surprised than me, but Pod is my winner. Thank you so much to the Women's Prize for sending me these books for my honest review. If you'd like a more in-depth analysis, if you want to get really geeky about these books, on my Patreon I do a weekly podcast, and at the moment I'm giving every book at least half an episode, if not a whole episode to itself, about my feelings about it. So if you'd like to hear more in-depth, gossipy, silly analysis from me, it's over there, and there's so many hours of it. Thank you for sitting here with me in my sparkly Women's Prize themed shirt. I'm a bit of a fangirl now, and it's one of my life goals to become a judge at some point, so stick with me. Thank you for watching the videos and humouring my obsessive rants about this prize that I also love. If you like this video, I think you might like one of these videos. Thank you so much for watching. This video was brought to you by the Gumption Club, who tip me per video to make sure they keep happening, and they also get a free podcast every week, so what's not to like? Let me know which of these books you'd like to read in the comments below. Frogsdog out.